Wine is a mocker, beer is a brawler, and whoever staggers because of them is not wise. Proverbs 21.
Welcome back to the Go to Hell podcast. Strong opinions weekly held about Christianity, the church, and beer. Now let's join our hosts, Tim Curley and Colton Pierce.
We're at an hour and a half.
Well, we got a ways to go. We're drinking a new beer here before we transition.
Well, we're going. We have a ways to go because you and I have it built into our mind that we have to go like an hour and a half per episode. Where everyone's like, you could just go like 45 minutes and be fine. So,
I don't know. This last episode we're gonna call Whammy.
Anyway, I become kind of famous for my signature catchphrase, Whammy, as in Gene Tennis at the plate. Whammy!
there you go.
We'll toss up a clip.
We'll do I'll clip it up to the first part, 45 minutes, because everyone will feel much better about 45 minutes after we did our 3.5 hour I left my liver in San Diego episode.
Yeah, everybody's like, what the hell was that? Yeah, you just need to call that one a deep cut episode. That's just really what it is. Well,
I did say in the show notes it's either going to be our most listened to or least listened to episode, but
it doesn't matter. We needed to decompress that weekend.
We did.
So,
we need to talk about it,
which is great.
Sitting here drinking beer, talking guys, dreaming, killing time, living life with some down.
Yeah, we're drinking now from 1852 Brew Co. We're drinking the 1 pint 7% ABV West Coast IPA called Unite and Strengthen. This is the one that I end up drinking on game days. It's less than the away days. The away days is 7.1%. This is 7%. But yet this thing, I kid you not, it'll hit you like a truck.
it has an IBU of 50.
Which is International Bitter Units, for anybody that doesn't know. So it's coming in at the standard, which is great. They give you like a little bar here on their can, which is kind of fun, to kind of show you where it's at bitter wise.
Yeah, it's funny. The IBU only applies to people who really like IPAs, because nobody who doesn't like IPAs is going to look at the IBU for
you wouldn't give a rat's
for the
ass.
hazy, and it's barely showing a bar. It says 20. It's like the average IPA person's like, no, I'm sorry, that's a bitter piece of shit beer. I'm not drinking it.
This beer is really tasty.
It is tasting, and back to both of us were talking about with Jeremy and his whole endeavor. He has on the can, props to him. And it goes to what I was saying. He has on the can culture, community, craft. He is committed to everything that they do there. Looks like there's an attention to detail. Someone's overlooking the facilities. They're not letting bathrooms pile up with toilet paper, hand paper, and the whole place is kept clean. Now, part of that is Jeremy will let people know you're not just a patron here. You're a member. You're a member. So clean it up as you go.
Yeah, and
don't rely on staff to clean things up, but there's an attention to detail. Everything's done in the way that I like businesses. That we would say the peak is the Apple computer, the computing idea of everything is done with quality, culture. And if we don't meet these high expectations, then what are we doing here? Then I'd rather not do it.
And if you're ever at 1852 Brew Co., odds are you will probably see Jeremy there. I think I've been there once, and Jeremy has not been there.
Every time I've been there, I've only met him. You said we're friends with Jeremy. I met him 3 times, but I will say every time I've met Jeremy, he's either very good at pretending that he knows people, and I'm not meaning that as a insult.
Because he meets like 2,000 people a day.
That is a gift to make every person you meet like I know I've met Jeremy twice, or I've met, but he's genuinely treated me like I know exactly who you are. I remember the conversation we had, and I'm glad you came here. How are you doing? And you can see that as being fake. And I just say, if you're that kind of person, stop reading so much into something. There's a value to someone just being treated like he's not trying to be phony.
And he's not. But that's
He's
the key
trying
thing.
to just
is
make
that,
you feel like you're truly valued and a member of a family.
And he could have. And the funny part is, he probably had somebody on his staff say, "Hey, I need something from the back or whatever," and he caught you on the way and he recognized you, and he'll come over and he'll say, "Hey, how are you doing?" And truly mean it, and like ask about you and stuff. He was asking me the other day if my wife was pregnant. It was about a month ago. He asked me if my wife was pregnant. He's like, "She's not really showing, but like she kind of had the waddle," and I just was curious. I was like, "Oh, is she expecting?" And I was like, "Yep, we're gonna have a little girl out here running on these soccer fields in a couple of years." So,
well, the first time I met him, I went up to him and introduced myself. I knew about the background. I knew he went to our church, and I just interjected, "Hey, if you're looking for soccer pictures, I've got a company that does that, and let me know if you want some stuff to throw up on the wall." So the next time I saw him, 2-3 minutes, I'm talking to him, and I'm like, he's acting like he remembers me, but I can't imagine he remembers me. I've only met him once, and it was at the World Cup event where there was like 500 people there.
yeah.
But then all of a sudden he says, "Hey, I'm still interested. I'm still thinking about getting some pictures. So, I'm going to hit you up for photos." I'm like, okay, damn, that guy remembered exactly who I was.
Yeah,
All right.
that's impressive. He's phenomenal.
You need to tell him about the photos you put up on your wall. So you'll be like, okay, yeah, I'm going to get some pictures up on the wall.
Yeah, because my wall looks awesome. I literally...
He's got spaces in the big room where they serve beer. There's plenty of room up there to put like 10, 20 prints up there.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have to spend more than $1,000 with the prints and nice framing, or even cheap framing, $500 to throw just a whole bunch of pictures up there.
Yeah. And I talked about it earlier. My room does look super sick. And if you know me, I'm really into trying to connect with a certain group, a certain outlier group in high schools. So just putting that up on my walls is just that much more inviting for that particular group to for me to connect with them and get them to at least get C's in their classes, so that way they can move on and do stuff with their lives. So it's really awesome. But again, honestly, I believe that beer tastes really good from the tap. But I think that this Unite and Strengthen, it tastes better from the can.
Really?
I drink a lot of Unite and Strengthen, and I had one last night, and I had one today, and I'm having one right now, and I'm like, this might be better from the can.
Just a side note, a couple episodes ago, if you're scoring at home, we tried. It wasn't Hetty Topper. It was the Doppelganger, because our round 2 was Doppelganger.
Yeah.
And we made comments about sediment. Now, one, I will stipulate those cans were about 3 months old, so we were pushing the limit. But 2, I remembered the cans are very explicit. You're supposed to drink from the can, and I think that's why. Because Andy and I then had the 2 remaining that I had in the refrigerator, and he's like, "Should I get glasses?" And I said, "Nope, you do not want to get a glass." And he and I polished off. There was no liquid in those cans, and we had no sediment chunks. So when the can says drink from the can, you probably should follow the instructions. It's not something that's tongue in cheek. So.
Yeah,
because we had an eighth of an inch of sediment in our glasses when we poured it out.
Oh my gosh!
And it was very off-putting.
Right, and that's always the hard part about sediment in beers. It happens. It's nothing like.
Oh, and some beers rely on it. That they need that. They want that sediment in there to add flavor. And if you're drinking from the keg over draft, it's not getting in your can. But that sediment is sitting in there. It's still adding flavor, blah 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 blah.
Right.
But if it comes out of the can, you just immediately like, that is an old beer. Why am I drinking it? It's got floaty stuff in there. That's terrible. But then I was thinking later, like, yeah, it does say drink from the can. That's probably why.
Yeah.
So a little tip there for you beer drinkers out there. If the can is adamant, and that's literally the only can I've ever seen that says drink from the can.
I think I've seen a couple that have said drink from the can. I've also seen ones
Read
that are
the
like,
instructions.
and especially with IPAs, for anybody that's out there and you're thinking about drinking an IPA, for anybody who hasn't, they're meant to be consumed quickly.
Yes.
They're not.
No.
They're not like stouts where you could keep them for
That's
like a
the
couple
problem with
years
them.
and stuff. Like it's you buy it, you drink it.
Yeah.
Is pretty much it. I mean, you could keep it for a couple of weeks and stuff.
Oh, I thought you meant like drink it like quickly that when you open it up. Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
well, yeah. Still, I'd say
No,
that as well.
IPAs need to be. They are super fresh for about a month. You can push it depending on the IPA for maybe 3 months, but if you're getting like 3-4 months,
And if it's a good enough IPA, it can stand that
it can
time,
stand.
but-
Well, if it's a really good IPA, it can stand 4 or 5 months, and what you're drinking is still good, but it is not what the
It's not the-
brewmaster
yeah, it's not the
intended
intended
when it
flavor
came
of
out. You'd be like,
Right.
oh, that's okay. And if you'd had it like a month, maybe a month out or two weeks out, it's like, oh, this is delicious. So
Right.
which is ironic because the entire IPA phenomenon goes back to when Britain, specifically the Indian
Trading Company.
Indian Trading Company, which was essentially Great Britain, if we're being honest, but the Indian Trading Company was shipping stuff all around the world to their mercantile businesses, both in what we now call the United States or North America and India itself and other places in Africa. What it would do was create a beer different than what was served on the island. They would serve an IPA, and the IPA had something was in the IPA. I don't remember what it is, that made the beer last longer on the boat when the sailors are out at sea and wanted to consume beer, or when they landed and were in port. So the irony is the whole IPA phenomenon originally back in the day was to preserve the beer longer. But that makes sense because back then they're probably making, in the UK they're making probably exclusively ales, and the ales are being made at a small scale, and so they're going through the ales all the time.
Right.
Stuff's not sitting around. If it's 1600s, 1700s, no one, including the richest people in the United Kingdom, have the capacity to have beer sitting around as a supply. You're just going through whatever you're brewing. So everything is quick. It's been brewed. It's set in a keg for a minimum amount of time. It's coming out. It's not, sitting in a dark room for months and months and months aging. And so, today we'd be like, that's insane because,
Right.
beer just sits around, and I can create a lager and it can sit in kegs for months before someone finally buys it from your local distributor or even cans and bottles. But back then it was like, no, we need something that will actually sit there and not sour or whatever the process was, and so that's what the IPA was. But yes, try to find as fresh as possible. If you're new to the IPA thing, you like them, look on the box, the can. Usually if it's a can, it's at the bottom of the can. It's literally stamped at the bottom of the can. If it's like in a cardboard box for like a 12-pack, it's probably somewhere on the box. If it's on the bottle, it could be anywhere. Somewhere on there will be a date. Try to find something within the last month or two.
Yes.
Okay. What do we want to do next? Satan?
Yeah, we could do the Satan topic. You listening to anything else besides Wham? All I gave us was Wham.
Okay. So the other music I've been listening to, and I've actually been listening to more than Wham,
Sure.
So, we're recording this on August 19th, Saturday. This week, Robbie Robertson, guitar player for the band, died at 80 years old.
Damn.
So, I am someone who listens to the band on a fairly regular basis. I find them just to be... if you're a music listener, they're a hidden gem. When you do some digging, the band... Well, let me do some background, and then... Let's do some background on this. If you're not familiar with the band, you should be. And if you are somewhat familiar, you should be more familiar. So the band, they started out in the 60s. They were a backup band to someone called Hawkins. I think his band was called The Hawk. He was a fairly prominent, famous musician in Canada. I think it was in Toronto. They were his backup act for a while. And I believe Bob Dylan discovered the band. They were made up of Robbie Robertson. The primary members were Robbie Robertson, who is the guitar player, and then his name is Leon Helm. Should know his name, Leon Helm. The guitar player, the drummer. The drummer is actually doing quite a bit of the vocals on a lot of their songs. Yes, he's playing drums and singing, which has always been just confounding me. I don't see how anyone keeps rhythm and sings. So they split for a little while, but the band transitions from there, and then they are the backup band for Bob Dylan for quite a while.
Nice.
They go out on tour with them. There's some, if you go on to Spotify, I haven't checked Apple Music. I should check Apple Music, but I'm sure it's on Apple Music too. There are Bob Dylan's released a bunch of bootleg albums where it's just basically, Bob apparently had enough money back in the day where he could just sit around and fuck around in the studio,
yeah,
and rack up studio time and pay whoever and just record a bunch of shit that never went out on an album. I don't know how that works.
Or had his own studio.
Or I guess had his own studio. But so he's released all of these bootleg studio recordings. And there's, I think, 2 with the band playing. And it's him doing some, them playing back up to some of Bob's stuff. They're doing covers of stuff. It's all really raw. I wouldn't say it's like amazing, but if you're into Bob Dylan, you just like music and you like some stuff where it's like, it's not great music, but you like the process of hearing people record and hone and hone and hone. It's really good. There's also stuff on, just as a side note, Spotify has, who's it you were listening to a couple weeks ago? The Irish guy.
Oh, I know.
His name always escapes me.
Why am I...
Into the Mystic, Caravan.
I know what you're talking about.
His name is always... I can never remember his name. I'm like, I know exactly who it is. As soon as I find it, it's going to be like, yes! Van Morrison.
There we go. I was like, what am I...
They're on, so Van Morrison's, I think it's his initial album. It's got the songs he's most famous for. Into the Mystic, Caravan, Night for the Romance, dun, dun, dun. Anyway, there are like 30 tracks.
I was like, Brown Eyed Girl is his most
Brown Eyed
famous.
Girl's another one.
I'm a big fan of Tupelo Honey, personally.
Tupelo Honey. There are like 30 additional tracks on Spotify where they're just doing like, there's like 8 failed versions of trying to do like a song. And it's great because you just hear him, and they'll include like him in full Irish, like, yeah, there's too much guitar on that. He's like going too fast. Can you slow him down? Can you like, it's got all of him like feeding back to the engineer and the producer, like, yeah, I don't like that. I need this. I need more of this, less of that. It's amazing.
That's awesome.
And none of them are as good as the version that actually ends up on the album, which is kind of comforting because not everything you get up in the album is actually what's great for music lovers. But if you like if you like the music process, find the bootleg tapes from Bob Dylan. There's all kinds. There's some that include the band. There's some that don't. So anyway, they back up Bob Dylan for a while. They break out on their own. They become what we now know the band. Leon Helm comes back as the drummer. The band is made up of Robbie Robertson. I don't remember the bassist. They've got horns. They've got this exceptional eclectic mix because there's 2 or 3 guys in the band that are much older than them, and they are classically trained as musicians. Like they went to music school and learned like classical music, and they're the guys playing like the oboe and
Yeah.
and piano and the organ and all that. They're like driving to be like, we're gonna just do like rock music that's being produced. We're like gonna insert stuff, and then the band's got this. Again, they get started as a Canadian band. I think Robbie himself was Canadian by birth. If you've ever heard Helm, he's clearly a Southerner. There's a strange like Confederate strain in their lyrics to a lot of stuff. It's not like pro-Confederate. It's just like Deep South. Anyway, so Robbie died. I was very sad. I was listening to a lot of the band. If you've never seen The Last Waltz or listened to The Last, I would very much, if you're listening to this, try to go watch The Last Waltz. It is their last concert. The band very much too soon, they decided we're breaking up. It was too much. It was too much of a grind. I think they spent too much on the road backing up people like Hawk and Dylan, and by the time they made it, they were tired of being on the road. And particularly in the 60s and the 70s, if you were going to make your music money personally, the record label was making all the money from your album sales.
Right.
You were making zero. If you wanted to make money, you had to be out performing 5 nights a week around North America. And I think it became too much of a grind, and they all either, because they were too tired or they had made just enough money, or like, we're done. They decided we're done. They'd become friends with Martin Scorsese. I don't know how that happened, but so they did one final hurrah. And I think the Fillmore was one of the big arenas up in San Francisco, and San Francisco Bay Area had all of the top venues for what we know as like 60s and 70s music. They do one last hurrah, and it is a hoot. It's a great concert to watch because you understand why the band was. If you were in music, meaning you were a musician, the band is who you turn to learn how to be a musician.
Right.
So at their last hurrah, they've got Van Morrison, they have Bob Dylan, they have Neil Diamond, they have all of the another female. They have all of the top people at music wanting to show up to do this last concert with these guys. And I imagine if you're into country music, you have no idea how much, if they're a really good country musician, they have gone back, they've listened to everything the band does, and they are emulating it, they're inserting it into their music. Norah Jones has always been very open that her, like one of her top music influencers was the band. In fact, at one of the I've been to 2 concerts, and both times she's done a band cover, and she did gorgeous versions of them. But gorgeous covers don't happen unless the original song was a phenomenal song as well.
Right.
And so
right.
they were the who's who of music. If you were a musician, and then you loved the band, and so if you like music and you not really into the band, dive into them, and you will really appreciate the level of musicianship, and as we've talked about in previous episodes, like lyrics, like they're talking about, like they're telling stories in their songs, and you're not really sure what they're telling, because again, they're kind of like a lot of like 19th century stories they're telling, it seems like.
Right.
But they are great stories that they're telling with great music, really enriched music. And so, yeah, soon as I saw it came across my phone, Robbie died. I was like, that's it. I think I stopped whatever podcast I was listening to, immediately stopped it, cranked up the band in my office that we're sitting in here now, and just listened for a couple days.
That's awesome.
I'm really mad. A lot of people are dying. I don't know if it's my stage in life or it's just a strange thing, but it seems like a lot of people that it's probably my stage of life. It's just the way we're reaching that
You're
part.
at that age now.
A lot like
You hit
there are
50
people that are 10 years older that are dying prematurely. Again, Robbie lived to a ripe age of 80. I mean, that's in any era. You've lived a full life. Anything over 80, you're just God's giving you borrowed time.
Right.
But I'm reaching now. Yeah, I'm now reaching that age. It's like, yeah, he's 30 years older than me, but he's dying, and it's like, fuck, pisses me off. But we're not immortal, so.
Yeah, I have been listening to, like I said, I turned my classroom into a skate shack. So I said I was listening to Weezer. I've also been listening to a lot of Yellowcard. If anybody's ever listened to Yellowcard, pop punk band. The funny part about Yellowcard is they use a violin in their punk band. And so it's and I have a really funny story about it. Was I went to a bar in Nashville, Tennessee, and if you go to Nashville and you go on Broadway, again, there's no cover charge whenever you go in any of these bars, but there's always live music playing in every single one. And we went upstairs to this one bar after we had a really interesting night at this blues cafe. If you haven't heard that story and you know me personally, come up to me and ask me about that story because it's hilarious. But anyways, me, Eric, and Alec, we were on a road trip for 2 weeks, and in the heart of our road trip, we hit Nashville, Tennessee, and we spent a couple of days there, and we go into this bar. We go into Chris Rock's place. Not Chris Rock's. Not Chris Rock.
Kid Rock.
Kid Rock. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, Kid Rock on. So if you've been to Nashville, if you haven't been to Nashville before, there's one street in the middle of downtown. It's called Broadway. All the places you want to go to, well, not all the places. You have to go to Broadway if you go to downtown Nashville, and on it are 15, 20 honky tonks.
I think it's like 40 or 50 is what it seems like.
There's a spot on the east. It's either the east or north side. I think it's the east side of Broadway. That the east side has the most famous people's honky tonks.
Yeah, so like Jason Aldean has
Jason
a spot.
Aldean,
Kid
a couple
Rock
other,
has a
yeah,
spot.
they got some, and
Kenny Chesney has a spot.
Kid Rock's anchors it because his is 4 stories.
Yeah, it's 4 stories, and so the first 2 levels are, and this is how a couple of them are. So the first 2 stories are in his spot are that's the main band is right there. Then a story above that is a completely different level. It's kind of almost nightclubish, but there's a band that plays up there.
Yeah.
And then the 4th story is the nightclub. So there's a DJ up in the 4th level.
Very clever on his part.
And what's sad is that a lot of people, well, I don't know if it's sad, but nobody really goes to the DJ rooms.
Right.
And there's a couple of them in Nashville, but nobody really goes to the DJs. Everybody wants to be where the live music is playing because those live musicians can literally play anything and sing anything. So if you want to hear a specific song, it's literally like a jukebox.
Yeah, if you go to Nashville, you'll realize how much unused talent is out there. Because these poor folks are just slogging, and they're doing perfectly good covers of songs that you know, and you're like, this person's amazing, and yet they are slogging it out playing for. They're
playing for tips on stools. Like that's literally it. But also, if you go to Nashville, if you've never been, they will be in your face about trying to get tips from you. They will like put a bucket like in your face and be like, "Hey, you better like pay me," because that's the only way that they're getting paid that night.
Right.
They only make money off of tips.
Yeah.
Nobody has paid them to be there. They are, like I said, there's no cover charge. There's none of that.
There's no cover charge.
If there was a cover charge in Nashville, nobody would be
Tootsie's has not paid them $100 to
Yep.
show up and
Nope.
play. They're not getting. There's no guarantee, and so they're very openly walking around. They'll initially start like, "Are you enjoying the music?" "Yes, I'm enjoying the music," and you kind of give them a look like, "I'm also still eating and enjoying my drink, so don't interrupt me." But they have to, like you said, they have to do it in order to get some money.
Yeah, and
So-
so we go to
Friendly tip if you go to Nashville: bring some cash and tip.
yeah.
Even if you don't think they're amazing, just pay it forward. Be a nice person. You're not, by you giving them $20, you're not encouraging them and perpetuating like mediocre talent. There's no mediocre talent on Broadway.
No, there's not.
So
Like,
even if they're not the best person you heard that night, you're not like in some capitalistic way just encouraging someone who's got no business playing music being out there. Just tip them some money.
no,
Be nice.
everyone that is out there is extremely talented, and like I said, they could play anything that you want.
Yeah.
And we went to Kid Rock's place, and while we were up there, they decided to play some Fall Out Boy. Which was hilarious. So we're up in the third story. So we're at the nightclub esque, but there's a live band up there, and they're playing Fall Out Boy, and they were like, "Yeah, there's a little pop punk for all of you." And my drunk ass, because I was drunk at that point, I had drank quite a few beers. I was like, I said, they had a girl up on stage who played the fiddle, and I said, "No shot in hell they don't know Ocean Avenue by Yellowcard." So I walked up there, and the bassist was accepting the tips because in order to buy a song, you have to pay them a tip. So I go up there with a $20 bill, and I hand it to the bassist, and I say, "You guys know Ocean Avenue by Yellowcard?" And he was like, "We got you." The fiddle player was a chick, and she was apparently dating the drummer, I guess, that she took a break. And so we go through, we're listening to a couple of songs or whatever, and I was like, "Man, dude, that bassist like freaking screwed me." Because I probably 45 minutes went by. And then the violinist comes back up on stage. And literally the drummer was like the MC for the band. So he would talk for them and do all their stuff. So the guy from the drums goes, "Some motherfucker in this bar heard pop punk earlier and saw that we had a fiddle player on stage and said, 'I bet they know Yellowcard.'" And I was like, "Yeah, that's exactly what I thought."
Well, and that's exactly the kind of thing you want to do. You want to say the thing that's easy. You want to be like, "Let me get back to you on that. I think I can do that."
The drummer goes, "I haven't played this song since junior high." And I was like, "Yes, like this is what I wanted."
Exactly.
And so they played that song, and it was awesome. It was phenomenal.
I walked 4
But
stories of stairs to get up here. You can play whatever I want you to play.
me, Eric, and Alec were dying laughing. Like, oh my gosh, he literally called out everything that I was thinking. I was like, "Yeah, I'm the drunk motherfucker. Here I am." It was so great. And it just topped off a really phenomenal night for me and Eric. Not necessarily Alec, but again, if you know me personally, come up and ask that question if you don't know what I'm talking about.
So that song is funny, and Yellowcard, because our friend JC that we've referenced to multiple times on this podcast, that was a pastor at our previous church and then got run out because he was too cool for school or too much of a dick or whatever
Whatever they said.
whatever the establishment thought. His first Sunday preaching at First Baptist Church in Tulare, he said, "I don't know how many people out there listen to Yellowcard." And I blurted out literally the song you just said. And and he goes, "Hey boy." Like, right. And he and I were already friends because I was on the board, and so we'd met and we'd already met, but he was like, "Yes, that is my friend right there."
That's amazing.
And I wasn't really a huge, I think I bought their, I think it was one of the last CDs I ever bought was that Yellowcard CD with that, because it was a good sound. You mentioned skate music, and I'm thinking more like ska, like No Doubt at their peak, not really poppy peak, but actual ska and Sublime and.
Yeah, Sublime. The hard part is like, when I say like skate music, again, it's skate music.
No, you were fine.
No, but I'm saying like skate music that I could play in my classroom. If you know Sublime, like I can't play Sublime in my classroom. I can play What I Got, I think, is
Real
clean.
Big Fish.
Yeah, like there's
you can play Real Big Fish Band.
There's a couple of them that I can
even
play,
like Blink 182, you could play it, but it's subversively.
Yeah, there's some that I can play
it's
in my
not
classroom.
explicit, but if you actually listen to the air, it's like, oh no, that's pretty filthy.
Yeah, exactly. I gotta be selective about what I can play in my classroom, but Yellowcard is one of those that I can play. I can play Weezer. I've got some Rise Against, which is JC, who you just talked about. That's his favorite band, and so I've been listening to some Rise Against recently. They're pretty anti-American, anti-American establishment, like consumerism kind of stuff is really a big push for them. So if that's not your forte, I completely understand. But they've got phenomenal songs out there. If you haven't listened to Savior,
I've made it clear on this podcast, I'm a child of Ronald Reagan, although I'm not anymore. But I've seen Rage Against Machine.
The yard guys there. He disappeared.
I have seen Rage Against Machine 4 times live, so
one of my favorite stories about Rage Against the Machine is when BBC asked them not to cuss.
Yeah.
Like, you can't.
It's like, who booked us?
BBC was like, there's this really hot American band called Rage Against the Machine, and Killing in the Name is one of their most popular songs, but they can't say, fuck you, I will do what you tell me on air. And I was like, did you not listen to the lyrics?
Yeah.
And so it's so funny because it's just like, do you not know who you were dealing with?
That's like booking a certain 5'4" man from Minneapolis and saying, Mr. Prince, can we not at all sing about sex in any of our songs? Is that possible? We really like the sound, but some of the sexual things that are coming out, we're not really keen on. Can we not sing about that?
It's like putting a microphone in front of Raymond Green and saying, "Hey, don't talk shit about the other team."
Yeah, we're gonna pull in NWA. We really like the vibe. It's very raw, and we really enjoy it. But
on police
force, but do we really do we have to talk about the police or the police, or as you say, the police? I don't want to offend, but can we talk a little bit less about that, and maybe a little more some of the milieu that you're finding interesting? Yeah. Don't. How about we not book?
That was so funny. And literally, if you see that video, they get a couple off before they cut. So it's so funny. Oh my gosh. Rage Against the Machine is a legend for doing that. And again, it's like, what were you thinking, BBC? What did you think was going to happen? The lyrics are, fuck you, I won't do what you tell me. Oh, it's so great. But
yes, we're introducing Rick James tonight, and so, but Mr. Rick, can we not do so much of the misogynistic lyrics that is there something a little more literary? Like, can we go somewhere more social commentary about the West and the Soviet Union?
And they say, yeah, I totally got that.
Whatever.
For you.
just give me on the TV, and I'll do whatever I'm gonna do, or the radio. There's a bleep button for that. Yeah, why are you gonna invite? Of course, everything about Ray Chance. Look, so I talked earlier. Accept what the problem is, and then we'll deal with the solution. I will admit, even back in the 2000s and the late 90s, as a conservative, what I would call myself a conservative back then, I accepted the social criticism that they were pointing out.
Right.
It's just I didn't agree necessarily. Well, not necessarily. I didn't agree with the solution that they were pointing out. But I did enjoy the music. And a lot of friends that I was friends with who actually enjoyed the music, but they enjoyed it just from a music standpoint. They liked the literal music, the kind of mix of rap and heavy metal.
We're talking about Rage still.
We're still talking about Rage.
Yeah, because
They didn't necessarily-
Bulls on Parade is a phenomenal song.
It is, but they didn't necessarily accept. They didn't even like the lyrics. I'm like, no, I actually accept the problem they're laying out. I think we got a problem with hyper capitalism and all these other things, and I think we do have a police problem. I don't think it's because police are the problem. I think we've got too many laws on the books and yada yada, and America's a violent society. But let's accept that let's just accept what they're singing about is a problem. Let's then and not fixate on what the solution is.
Yeah.
What they were, they were avowed communists because they were all from Harvard or MIT or whatever. I'm like, okay, fine, you're a communist. You're, whatever. That ain't gonna work either. But fine. And that's why I went to 4 of their concerts. So my buddy John saw them in the Netherlands and I think Japan as well. He went that far around the globe to see them. And John's about a conservative as you can get. So, okay. 2 hours and 11 minutes. We want to do Satan or we want to do Russell Moore's thing on how to fix the church and why old people are leaving the church?
Let's do Satan.
Well, isn't that special? Is that advice coming from you, Ann, or is it coming from someone else? Like, I don't know, say, Satan? Well, that's enough of you. Now let's give a big
We've spent a lot of time, I think appropriately, this is how we should be spending our lives, trying to take everyday stories, interactions, and applying them as Christians and how we should lead ourselves to other people. But now we're going to kind of get more down deep in the weeds, which we do sometimes, but I don't think as Christians always have to. But we're going to get kind of theological here, and we're going to deal with the issue of Satan, or as his original name, I believe in the Hebrew, but is Satan. Because Christianity has really taken the idea of Satan, and we'll get into who or what Satan is from a proper modern biblical view, now that we know what we know about the Bible and interpreting scripture and language and all that kind of stuff. We've taken Satan and certain segments of Christianity have taken Satan and really run with it to a detrimental. It's been detrimental to either general faith, like entire denominations, and personal faith, is what I would say.
Yeah.
And again, understand, before we get into this, the church is in an interesting place. I think part of the problem as Christians is I'm 51 years old. If you're my age, there was a lot of stuff going on in seminary circles where people, like actual academics, were able, somewhere in the 20th century, we were because we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls and a lot of archaeological things that then started informing how we read the Bible. It started changing the way academics were reading the Bible. Yeah. Now the problem is, I'm going to say this is a problem because I include our friend that we referenced on here before, Dan McClellan. That leads them to be, if you're overly, look, you either believe in Jesus or you don't. I'm not sure Dan does. I would love to have him on the podcast just for him to declare, because I can't tell between his podcast and his TikTok talks if he does. He is so academic, I can't tell. But put that aside. Nothing that we're finding out in as we find out more about language and the archaeology that we're finding that informs the Bible and all that kind of stuff, is dissuading me from the belief in Jesus and who he was. For some people it is. A lot of people went into theology in the 20th and 21st century believing they were Christian, and because what they were told was based on arguably a first millennium, but at least, let's say, a 17th century, 18th century view of Christianity that had not been updated. They had always been told everything's this way, and if it's not, then Jesus isn't who he says he is, and then they're being told, because of empirical evidence, that's not what was written in the Bible. They're like, well, then the whole thing's a fraud. Am I right, Colton? I think that's happened to a lot of people.
Yes, a lot of people.
We should never take that view. Look, if you take that view, fine. Whatever. But if you believe in Jesus, that's fine. But you should be open, I think, and what we're trying to do on this podcast is open up, like, there are things in the Old Testament, well, particularly in the Old Testament, that we've been told to believe in, because we have this, as we've mocked before, this, like, Sunday school view of the Old Testament where we're supposed to take great pleasure in the flood and David slaying God, David, which neither of which are from a Jesus perspective thing. Okay, so I lay all that out because we have a view, whether you're an evangelical or a fundamentalist or whatever, we have this kind of view of Satan as being a person. And we now have enough understanding of the Old Testament in particular, but even the New Testament, now that we've digged into it and what the language is, that is not probably what you've been told either in Sunday school, college group, whatever, and maybe even on Sunday, is not who Satan is. Am I right, Colton?
Yes.
And then, so we're going to dig into that. That's what we're going to do. And if you're like, I don't really care because I don't really think about Satan, then okay, fine. Skip this part of the podcast. But you might find it interesting. So, Satan.
Let's talk about him.
In the Old Testament, Satan is referenced in the Old Testament, according to what I have in front of me, 27 times in what we would call the Old Testament, what other people would call the Hebrew Bible.
Hebrew Bible, yep.
What other people would call, well, there's if you go from there, then there's two or three. The Hebrew Bible's separated into two or three things, right?
Scholars.
It's the Septuagint and
the Septuagint and
No, not. Anyway.
Well, and there's still what's tough about the Septuagint is you have the Greek influence in the Septuagint, so that's why some people don't recognize it. That's why us as Christians do not recognize the Septuagint. It's because Martin Luther said that the Septuagint has original Greek texts.
Okay, that's a good point. And again, look, we're going to stick with this because I want people to understand if they're sticking with us here. We are getting in the weeds. This is weed stuff. If you're listening to this podcast,
but you should know this. Like,
you should know this. Stick with it.
Anybody that's listening to this podcast should know that
Let's not be a little child Christian. Let's understand the faith that you're being taught and what is actually the truth.
If you read a Catholic Bible, you'll sit there and be like, why are there extra books in this Bible versus a regular one? The reason is that their Bible is not the Hebrew Bible, it's the Septuagint. And that's what Christians used all the way up until the time of Martin Luther as their Old Testament, so to speak. And through that Old Testament Septuagint there are some texts in there that are originally written in Greek. And actually what that does is it actually gives us less of a gap. So there is a gap between the Old Testament to the New Testament of about 700 years. It's like
Correct.
it's like 300 to 700 years. I was like, I'm saying this off the top of my head after I've had a couple of years. So I'm like, don't.
Always the best time to have a deep dive.
Yeah, I was like, don't quote me on
discussion
this.
on
I was like, now that I'm
the
like
Bible.
talking about it, I'm like, but there is a
there at least 500, around 500, give or take.
there
years.
is a time discrepancy in between, and so, but we also need to understand history and really understand Hellenism and how that influenced the rest of the world. We've talked about it on this podcast before, where there's a speculation whether or not Jesus spoke Greek. We know that he spoke Aramaic, but there's a high possibility that he spoke Greek.
Right.
And that's because of the Hellenistic influence. And when I say Hellenistic, if you guys don't know about Alexander the Great and his, what we call is Hellenism, is this idea of he wanted one common language across his empire.
Right.
And so he pushed for Greek. And so even though everything was taken over by the Roman Empire, so oftentimes when people look at language, they associate Latin with the Roman Empire, Greek with the
Latin was a later thing that came along.
right, with the
much
Macedonian
later.
Empire. And it was AD, like 100 or 200 AD, that Latin became Rome's
Correct.
language. And it became Rome's language because they didn't want to have, they were like, it was almost like a purist thing, was why Latin. It was, oh no, we can't speak Greek. That's somebody else's
Correct.
language.
It was a sign that it was an understanding that the empire was waning, but
right, it
really.
was almost this kind of elitist thing.
yeah,
that
it was
kinda-
like, all right,
that
we're
kinda
gonna
took
keep this
over,
thing
so.
going, so we're gonna go all in Greek. This is an important point too, because we don't have the Septuagint in our Protestant Bible, but understand this is how it's related. If you've grown up in the church but you never like done any deep dive, it's either been inferred or you just assumed, which correctly you assumed. If you've never gone to seminary, you probably think, because the way you read it, it would be completely logical that Job is the oldest book in the Bible, because it speaks in a way that does not speak about Israel, and even the way it talks about God, blah, 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 blah. It seems like the oldest book. It is actually one of the youngest books written in the Old Testament. It was probably written maybe 200-300 years before Jesus. And that is not to say that it is not an important book, but it is a book that is written in Babylon, when Israel is still part of Babylon. It is the reason why the language seems old is because it is taking a lot of language and stories from the Babylonian Empire and what their religion is. And so it's a different book, even though it's very important. I think you and I both agree. At some point we will, after doing our own research, do a episode on Job, because it's one of the most fascinating books in the Bible.
Yeah, and you'll find that a majority of so biblical tradition, which is not, just so we're clear, that's not helpful.
No.
But biblical tradition will say that a majority of the books that are written in the Old Testament was written prior to Babylon. And so, like, Moses was the author of the...
Yeah, and that's not really true.
What's the first 5 books of the Bible called again?
Not the Pentateuch.
No, it's the...
Anyway, yeah. Correct. Whatever the term is,
We're drinking beers.
They were not actually written when you were told they're being told. They were actually
everybody will
written...
tell you that it's Moses. And again, it doesn't mean that it's not Moses' story. There's speculation out there whether or not Moses existed, into which I've heard arguments for it. But yet, still at the end of the day, you have to, like, there is evidence that proves that not necessarily that Moses existed, but there had to be some type of leader.
Correct.
For them. So it's like, you might as well just tag a name on him and call him Moses. Like, there's no way to prove, like, these bones are Moses's or something like that. So you can sit there. And again, when it comes to religion and it comes to faith and that kind of stuff, people are trying to get as many facts as possible. So people are trying to go out there and get this kind of information. And there's stuff out there. If you go out there and you look about Moses' story, you're going to find that there may be some things that you may not agree with or whatever. And that's okay. You're gonna have to wrestle with some of those things, right? Like the water splitting and all that kind of stuff, and what sea they actually crossed and all that kind of yeah. But that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about today is, again, we need to recognize that in the Old Testament, we don't, as modern day Christians, our Bibles that we receive, unless you're getting a Catholic type Bible, they do not have those Greek texts included. And we've talked about texts that they've excluded before. And yes, it is a selection process and all that kind of stuff. So that's fair to say. Any of you can say that at any time. But where were we going with that? With the Septuagint?
Okay, so if you take the Hebrew Bible, if you take the Hebrew Bible, so that means the Protestant Bible, what we would call the Protestant Bible. If you're listening to this, the Protestant Bible.
The Hebrew Bible. Well, the Hebrew Bible is the Old Testament only.
Correct. But so if you're like, okay, I'm not really sure, but if you're not a Catholic, what you've probably read your entire life, that's the Hebrew Bible.
Yes, the Old Testament is the Hebrew Bible.
Satan is referenced, and I'm not saying like he is named literally Satan. I'm saying he is referenced directly or indirectly 22 times in the Hebrew Bible. So Satan is a Hebrew word, and it literally means accuser, adversary, or opponent, or opponent.
Right.
And that's important.
It's extremely important.
Because in those 22 references, if you've grown up in the church, you have an idea of Satan as being this angel that's fallen from God. And, he was one of the chief archangels, and he's fallen from God, and now he's fallen from heaven because he got too vain. And so he's this thing. And what Colton and I are going to tell you is, I'm not saying he's not that thing, but when the Hebrew Bible refers to Satan, it is not actually referring to what you think it is. It is referring to an accuser, an adversary, and an opponent. And in some scripture, the scripture is vague and seems to be alluding to a spiritual being, which might be a being of the might be a demigod, which has a whole other conversation that now modern theology is the kingdom, not the kingdom. Anyway, but it is also referencing literal people. It is sometimes Satan is referring to a person. It is a king or a chief of a tribe who is opposed to Israel, and that person is being referred to as Satan.
Yeah, so with the accuser thing, and where I really want to start this conversation, and I don't know where Tim's going with this because Tim's got a laundry list of things that he needs to go through. Something that's really important to think about is, and I'm glad that you brought up Job earlier, because I think that Job is a really good opportunity to sit there and think about this, because everybody talks about Satan coming up there and having this discussion with God about how he's like, okay, Job is this only person. And so that follows you, and like, let me go and I can destroy his livelihood and he will run away from you. And so aside from there and Stephen's execution and Revelation,
yes,
we have almost, and this is, and hopefully if you're listening to this, you're not offended by what I'm about to say. You almost have this kind of Mount Olympus for those three circumstances kind of view of God, and where God is
He's
Zeus in
charge
his
of
high
a pantheon
chair,
of gods.
right? You know, and there's
the term I couldn't remember was he is in charge of a divine council. Is the term.
Yeah, he's like the pantheon.
Correct.
Is like there, you know, like there's everybody.
So
comes...
there's now a modern strain of seminary interpretation to look at Babel, where God basically is like, I'm done with all the other nations. I'm casting them out.
Yeah.
And all of those nations are going to get a member of my divine council as their demigod. And I'm going to become the one God of Israel. And I'm going to ride this out. And then Jesus comes along and becomes the thing that casts out the demigods. And everything comes back again under God and one God rule.
Right.
Which I'm sure people right now are like, what the hell are you talking about? You've had too many beer. No, that is actual thing. We should get into divine council because it's mentioned quite a... There are allusions to it in Genesis, in Numbers, in Job. It is all throughout the Old Testament, this idea. And my view of that is that's because we're, again, if you read the Bible from a divine perspective, like God's telling people to write stuff down, that's problematic.
Yeah.
Because then you have to believe, because the language is very clear, folks. If you break down the Hebrew word, it means something like divine counsel. Whatever you think that word is in English that you've been told is not actually accurate.
Right.
It means something like, yes, there is a God, but much like we view the Roman gods and the Greek gods and Babylonian gods and say, oh, that's kooky talk that there's more than one God. The Hebrew Bible actually alludes to that as well. Yeah. My view of that is humanity trying to understand who God is and what nature is and how nature and God work together. And it's so, Colton, I think, agrees. I don't view the New Testament as a piece of paper where God was telling someone to write down how the world works. It is people trying to figure that out. And so it stands to reason that if you live in the Mesopotamian Near East area and everyone, and arguably pretty much all primitive people around the world, view the world as it is arguably a very modern view to look at the world as a monotheistic way. Yeah. And in fact, modern theological view says even the Jews, we should do this. There are passages in the New Testament where Paul seems to be operating under a polytheistic worldview, where he is saying, no, God is the primary God. Now so anyway, we are under a delusion that the monotheism was a thing, and the Jews of the Old Testament believed in monotheism. They did not. They just believed their God was better than every other God, just like the Romans did, just like the Babylonians did, the Mesopotamians did, etc., etc., etc. So again, we're not trying to dismiss Christianity or even Judaism. It's just, let's have a healthy perspective of what the world was.
Well, and still, actually, this is... I've talked about this before. Well, I don't think I've talked about it on the podcast, but I think I've talked to you about it. But I don't think I've explained it in this way before, but this is why I think that, and I didn't like this book this year. This is one of the, I didn't like it for a variety of reasons, but I read American Gods by Neil Gaiman.
Oh, yeah. And I did not watch the TV show because I found it very decadent. And I was like, it's too dark for me.
Which is fair. The book was dark. And I struggled with a lot of the book. But I told Tim, I'm trying to read my way through. NPR put out, like 10 years ago, they put out a top 100 list.
Yeah, so you're doing your due diligence. You're trying to read through everything.
I'm trying to read through their top 100s fantasy sci-fi books that are on their list. And that list was not created by them. That was created by fans. So everybody voted and all that kind of stuff. Shocker, Lord of the Rings was number one. But so we get to American Gods, and I was reading through it.
If that list had been done in the 80s, it would have been Catcher in the Rye, but
That's not sci-fi fantasy though. Like,
true enough. Okay, anyway, go ahead.
it's a phenomenal book. Like, I don't, but
Necromancer.
when it came to American Gods, Necromancer's on the list. There's this idea again of the god the gods gain energy in that book based off of if you recognize them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you have to recognize them in order for them to have power. And so what's actually happening is, and it's a claim that's made in the book over and over again, is that America is not a place for gods. Or is not a place for the old gods. Because Americans don't believe in tradition. They don't, and we have our traditions in America, but they're not like what they got in Europe or whatever.
No, they're nascent compared to human history. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, and so there's this whole claim throughout the entirety of it, and the thing is, Odin and Loki are trying to hatch a scheme to try to make themselves immortal for the rest of time. So they're, so Loki loves chaos and Odin loves war. And so both of them are hatching the scheme. For anybody who's never read it, that's their whole idea, is they're trying to create an opportunity to where both of them can continue to live, because they continue to fade out as there's less chaos and there's less war within the country itself. And so this is a huge element throughout the book, but at the same time, there's this idea that, and this is true, and what you were talking about earlier, where God says you shall have no other gods before me. And I'm not recognizing that there's other gods out there in the world, but I'm still saying that we create gods for ourselves.
Correct.
To where there are, and again, those are those idols or whatever you want to call it. We are making things. And this is the funny part about the book, is that the book talks about there's a technology god, there's a internet god, there's a couple of different gods that are the new gods in the world, and they are disgusting and grotesque, and they're bad guys in the whole scheme of things, and you don't want to be associated with them, but those are the gods that we are creating in the United States. Whether we recognize it or not, we're sitting there and we are giving our time, our dedication to those things. And so, Neil Gaiman I said that I didn't like the book because there was a lot of things that I struggled with the book. A lot of things that just made me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that's just my own reading preference. But when I finished the book, I was 100%, I was like, I can see why that's considered a top book and why somebody would want to make a TV series about it, is because I was like, I understand that. I think it was good. And again, trying to be critical of it, I think that it's a really good book. I think Neil Gaiman writes really well. But just for me, it was really off-putting and grotesque. And so it was just like, meh. But I can see why it has a lot of acclaim to it. But again, and that's what I'm saying right now before we get into this discussion, is there is this idea that, again, gods are and gods, little g, are created by us. Zeus is someone that we created.
Correct. Yeah.
We give them power in our minds. And that's going to be crucial to the conversation today. Is that if we continue to give power to things in our minds, and we've had this discussion before on this podcast, is when we've talked about how us in the United States, we don't really believe in demon possession, or we don't believe in this, but other countries apparently experience it fairly regularly.
We are so enlightenment driven that we ignore the spiritual to our detriment.
And
well, we have two extremes. Most of us go around and let's just say Christians. Well, no, the vast majority of America is in a state of schizophrenia, and it's because we actually don't take the spiritual side seriously. To where, whether you're Christian or not Christian, because we don't actually, let's just say for a lot of people listening to this, you don't accept because you don't own a gun, you don't have a healthy appreciation for it. You truly don't, even though you say you don't like it, you don't understand you don't truly understand the dangerousness of it. You also don't understand what it can do. And because we are so intellectual in the United States, we have a Christian culture that is either and you and I have both agreed on this in the recent podcast, spiritual side is our shortcoming. We are not good on prayer. We're not good at recognizing the Holy Spirit. We are, dare I say, sinful in that part. It is a blind side to us. That said, there's a whole side, the other spectrum of Christianity, that completely only feeds in the United States, and I would also say around the world, where they're very spiritual, only feeds on the spiritual side to their detriment and leads them to be stilted, childish Christians, because everything is viewed through the Spirit and the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues and blah, 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 blah. Everything is basically no different than the secular kids who go out to a rave on Friday nights and Saturday nights, and everything is about a drug-induced high. And the spiritual side of Christianity is, I'm not getting this spiritual, not drug, but spiritual-induced high, then my Christianity is not real. But then we have in the secular side, just what I was talking about. We have the side that I don't really believe in the spiritual world, but because I don't believe in the spiritual world, I'm going to take drugs in order to induce a spiritual high, because I refuse to accept there's a spiritual world. Or the stuff that I don't like, we flirt with the demonic stuff in movies and TV shows that freaks the fuck out of me. And we don't take seriously, even though I don't necessarily think Satan or Satan is an individual person we should be worried about. There is a side, a dark side, that we don't take seriously. We flirt with in the movies that come out, in the TV shows, and we don't take it seriously to our detriment. So that's my both Christian and secular criticism of.
Right.
That's the problem we have. I've never watched The Exorcist.
I will never watch it.
And I won't. I've watched. Well, we'll get into that story, but I won't watch that kind of stuff because it freaks me out. It freaks me out because I do believe there is a truth to it, and I don't think it should be popularized. Literally, if you're watching a movie, that's pop art. Pop is short for popularized. I don't think that kind of thing should be popularized, therefore dehumanizing, desensitizing oneself to that realm of spirituality. I think where you and I agree with this idea of divine counsel is people that God possibly allows. Oh, we're now on another beer. Colton's. We've hit the non-alcoholic. All right. Let me wrap this up and then we'll hit the beer. Anyway, we'll wrap it up. Satan is not one person. He seems to be he is an interchangeable figure within the Old Testament and the New Testament. I'll wrap it up by saying Paul himself seems to allude in some of his writings of a divine council and multi-gods. And if you're hearing this and you don't like it, I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. All right, now, the third beer of the week. Or Colton, what's our beer of the week?
I don't know.
You don't like
okay.
it?
I don't like the nose on it. Okay. He says our third
Well,
beer.
luckily you're drinking from a narrow glass instead of a wide glass. So you're getting less nose.
Okay.
I don't understand. Oh, finish. Before I push back, just finish.
So Tim said we're on our third beer of the week, but this is actually Tim's fourth beer of this
It is
week.
my fourth beer.
Um,
I'm going to be cooked all day.
okay, this has no alcohol.
Well, it's a quote-unquote non-alcoholic beer.
Okay, so it's non-alcoholic. It has a 0.5% alcohol by volume. And
It's better. I bet you that's better than that hop water trash that Kellen drinks from Lagunitas.
I have no idea. I haven't tasted it yet. I just telling you what the nose is.
Oh, you just smelled it.
Yeah, that was it.
Oh, okay.
This is from Athletic Brewing Company.
Their
Run
whole
Wild.
shtick is non-alcoholic. Sorry.
How do you have a brew company and you're all non-alcoholic? Okay.
Because their former... the guy who started this, I think, is a former marathon runner, and so he wanted something... He likes IPAs, but he wanted he didn't want all the calories from a full-bodied beer.
Fucking nerd. Okay. All right, so here we go. The Run Wild IPA.
It's the perfect beer for your dad.
My dad doesn't give two shit. And most of those marathon runners don't give two flying fucks. They want to feel something is really what it is. They're like, golly.
Well, I'd rather drink that than what I'm giving at the marathon, which is what Michelob Ultra. Anyway, continue. You don't like it. Now he's tasted it. You don't like it?
That tastes how that smells. Do you like that? That tastes like fermented hops.
It's fine. It's not great.
I can't believe you sat there and said this.
Okay.
That's
let
on
me just...
flavor alone. I'll go give that to freaking Alec and Pet, and I won't tell them that it has 0.5% alcohol in it, and they will literally be like, "This is not good."
It's all fair. This was not. I didn't purchase this for you. Let's just be clear. Colton is 6'2" and skinny, and rail skinny. I am much shorter and fatter. So for the fat fuck who can't drink beer all the time, I bought this as something that I could maybe drink and not drink all the calories. So,
Dude, I can't finish that. That
you
is.
don't have to.
I think it's fine on the front end. It's not good on the back end. That smells like the hops that are sitting outside of Kauai that I can't stand the smell of.
I don't pick that up at all, but I'm not discounting what you're picking up on. I might be very generous, but
Hey, if you like it, that's good. I'm happy for you. No for me. And I had no expectations for that beer. I was like,
believe that. I don't believe that. But
no,
whatever.
I didn't give two shits about it being non-alcoholic. I was like, I gotta drive after this. I was like, oh, cool. Like,
Well, there's
hopefully
plenty
I
of
can
Coors
still-
and Coors Light in the fridge if you want to drink that instead.
That's probably what I'm gonna have to have.
Okay.
And again, I don't have any issue with the fact that that's non-alcoholic. It's flavor profile alone for myself. Like, ooh, no. Shake. Good boys. No, I didn't ask for it. Say, shake. Shake. Very good boy. Shake. Nope, not in my face. Yeah. Okay. So where are we going from here?
So, Satan. Let's lay some more groundwork so people don't think we're just like pulling stuff out. Just making stuff up. Well, I won't do the full Dan McClellan and like lay out every verse that's proving my point. But okay. Again, there's 27 references in the Hebrew Bible. You mentioned Job.
Yes.
I don't know that he's specifically listed as Satan, but
No,
people
he's-
assume he is. And so this is one of those. I don't think it's the only one in the old, what we would call the Old Testament, whereas Satan is used as God's accuser. So again, he's not necessarily a fallen angel who's been cast out by God. He's the guy in, shall we say, the celestial palace who is saying, this guy, you love this guy Job. You say he's perfect. But I, as your royal accuser, God, say he is not perfect. And God says, oh, really? You want to wager on that?
Right.
But in other instances, in Isaiah 14, he is listed, but I think he's in Isaiah. I think he's mentioned as Lucifer, which is not a Hebrew word. I think it's a Greek word. No, it's a Roman word for Venus. But in Isaiah 14, Satan is referenced, but he's to be understood as the king of
Pain.
Babylon.
Oh.
What were you going to say?
Say King of Pain.
Oh, king of pain. Babylon. What else? Numbers 22, I think, is the earliest reference to Satan. Again, we as modern Christians look at Satan as being the snake in the Garden of Eden, but that is not really a classical view. Well, we look at him as Satan, and it's Satan taking on the form of a snake. But really what the view should be is the snake is just a representation, again, of just an accuser. An accuser, an adversary, an opponent, someone pointing out, well, you say, God says we should live this way. But I say, I'm telling you, Adam and Eve, we should live this way. And we take that as modern Christians as Satan takes the form of the snake. And I would argue, no, that's you're now inserting something into the text that's should not be there. Satan's not a person in the text. The snake is certainly representative. We're not saying that the snake is literally coming up across Adam and Eve and saying, you shouldn't do what God says. The point is, God, Satan, if we take the snake, is more of a concept. What another one? We mentioned Job. And then we get into the whole thing of Genesis 6. Genesis 6, which I would love to have a whole episode on because it is a complete waste of time as a Christian, but it's fucking fabulous. It's very fascinating. The whole entrance of the Nephilim.
Oh yeah.
And again, this idea that these people who are part of the God's divine council decide to rebel from God. What are these divine council? Are they demigods? Are they gods? Are they fallen angels? We're not really sure, but they come down to earth. They lead to this rebellion. Satan's a part of it. So again, we've been fed this thing as Christians, and I understand why. It's easy to understand simple narratives that Satan rebelled, angels rebelled, but if you look back at the text, that is not how the text really lays out who these people are, what they are. And it's not to necessarily mean, that doesn't mean that we have to throw out everything we believe. Just understand, that's not really for 2,000 years or 1,600 years or 1,800 years how the church has understood what these texts means. Okay, so who is Satan? Well, that depends, I guess, on who you are as a Christian. So we've just laid out the fact that Colton and I don't believe Satan is an individual person. You might be listening to this and you think, no, Satan is an archangel who rebelled against God and has now been cast out, and he's engaged in spiritual warfare against God. That's fine. I am not, even though we've laid out kind of what the classicist view of who Satan is. If your view is Satan is an archangel who rebelled and is now in spiritual warfare against God, I'm not going to say that's kooky talk because, I mean, we're all kind of speculating here, I think is the point. The problem Colton and I would have is the church has adopted that Satan in particular has become a scapegoat for Christianity, correct?
Yeah.
And that we're now getting to the heart of the matter. We've bumbled around. We've intentionally tried to give everyone some expose people to some like seminary views, like if you will, like deep theological seminary views of how academia looks at Satan now. But if we're getting to the heart of matter and what our faith is, depending on what your background in the church is, what denomination you're in. Let's say if, as we mentioned before, if you're more towards the Pentecostal side, you view Satan as a foil.
Right.
As an enemy. As someone who is daily engaged in warfare. And I would say to you, again, when I say this, I don't mean if you believe this and you hear everything I say and you still think I'm wrong, that you are not a Christian. That's not my point. You are incorrect. Satan is not the doppelganger to God, which is what he is viewed by a lot of people in the church.
Yeah.
And you hear that in their daily language. Oh, I feel like Satan's at war with me. Look. Let's agree. Even though we've spent the last 20, 30 minutes talking about there's Satan, there's an idea of Satan, maybe Satan's a person, there's this idea of the divine council, even though this blows your mind, there actually might be, counter to what Christians believe, a demigod there might be demigods, or it's just a view of demigods, trying to understand how the world works. Let's just say there are literally demigods. And Satan's one of them who's rebelled against God. He is not God. He does not have the God is omnipresent. He is omnipotent. He is omnipresent. That does not make, as some segments of the church made him out to be, and the opposite of that.
Yeah.
He is not, what do they call it? He is not Bizarro God, as they would say in the in the Marvel comic world or Seinfeld. He is not Bizarro God. He is not around the world simultaneously trying to convince you to marry the wrong person or go to the wrong college or make the wrong decision at work, while he's also inducing Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine and then induce this really rich person who owns a company to screw over a bunch of poor people. That is not Satan. If you take the most Christian monotheistic view of Satan, Satan is not capable of that.
No.
Now, that is not to say that it's perfectly acceptable to say that there are demons who are working for Satan on his behalf. And I think, would you agree with that, Colton? I think that's where you and I both are uncomfortable talking about it, but we both admit that there is a spiritual warfare.
Yes.
But too many Christians want to pin it on Satan, like Satan. And so I'll take it a step further. Satan does not even have the power to direct all of the demons underneath him to engage in what you think. Because you might say, okay, well, Satan's not doing, but he's telling all the demons to do it. No, even he does not have the power to do that.
Right. Yeah, I think what's always hard is that we focus on Satan for so much and we give him more power than what he actually has. Just Satan is this entity where a lot of time The hard part is we recognize, and it almost seems, and I'm trying to say this delicately, we try to externalize our inner thoughts and our own inner feelings.
Exactly. We scapegoat.
Yeah, exactly. And we use Satan as that scapegoat. We say,
Well, that's the worst form of. Let's say I'll pick on Pentecostals, but if
Right.
you find this offensive and you're Pentecostal, I don't. But there's
Get
a
over it.
strain of the Pentecostalism of I feel like I'm being. Well, I'll just take Pentecostal. There's a healthy strain of Christianity that runs around saying like I feel like I'm being tempted by the devil. I'm being tempted by the devil. Being tempted by the devil. It's like no. That's just you being your fallen self. The devil's got nothing to do with it. You're trying to blame someone else rather than understand, no, that is your inner fallen natural self depravity.
Right, and for some of you, you might be sitting there and thinking like, well, I can't do anything about it. Like the devil is like coming over me or whatever. And it's like, nope, that's not the devil. That's you wanting that. You want that. Like,
And I think that's how I would view a lot of these old texts that we're talking about where Satan is referenced. Is like, no, you're just, it's an old writer from 600 BC trying to come up with a reason why someone would go out and behave their way. And it's like, oh, it's got to be one of these satans who's challenging
Right,
God.
these
It's like,
tempters.
no, it's just human depravity.
no, it's your nature, and God has asked you not to fall to that. God, and that's what Christianity is asking from you, is saying, hey, this is the natural occurrence of how humans are without my guidance. And I am asking you to be better than that.
Correct.
And so you're sitting there and you're like, well, I want to do this and I want to do that. And it's like, yeah, that's natural for your body to want. And that's why when they talk about Christianity is difficult, that's what they're talking about. Is you are going against human nature. On a regular basis, you are sitting there and saying that I don't want to be a part of what this is. Because again, God recognizes, hey, this is not good for you. This is not good for you. This is not good for you. And so that's why he lays that out for you. But yet, again and again, we fall into that temptation, and it's not from Satan. It's from ourselves that we're fighting against. Because again, if you look at the Adam and Eve story, the snake still gets punished, but so does the man and the woman. Because
Right.
again, it is their free will that they choose. You have free will. So you can sit there and you are looking at option A and option B. You can say, I can do this or I cannot do this. That's a very binary decision. We have binary decisions in our lives, and especially when it comes to these temptations that we're talking about. You can either engage in this activity or you can choose not to. And you are inclined to, if you are sitting there and you're like, well, I choose to engage in it, and you're like, well, the devil got me, and it's like, nope, you got you. That was your decision to make.
Yeah.
You could have chosen God's way, which he wants for you, or you could choose this other way, which you wanted for yourself. And didn't care about anything else. Literally anything else. And so that's where the problem is. And what we're getting at in this conversation, I don't know how long today's conversation is going to go with this.
Well, there's another side to this that's even darker, but let's all get to that when you wrap up.
Because what I'm saying is that people use this language all the time. Pastors use this language all the time.
Yeah, it's used as
The
either
enemy.
the devil,
The
enemy,
devil.
the
And-
devil, which is a Greek term. It's not the devil, which is referenced in the New Testament. That's a Greek term, but it's the same. It's the same concept. It's the accuser. Basically it's a scapegoat. I view it as a scapegoat.
Yeah, I view it as a scapegoat too, to where you don't have to blame yourself. You can blame somebody
Correct.
else. And that's not what's happening. You need to sit there and reflect on yourself and sit there and say, nope, it was me. And we're not talking about you being demon possessed. We're not talking about this, but don't sit there and say I was demon possessed. Like, you wouldn't sit there and say that, right? Like, you wouldn't sit there and say a demon came over me and possessed me to do this, like, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type shit, where I just, like, go and I murder someone, you know? It's not that for you, right? Like, that's not what's happening. So, I don't know. That's where I get off.
Well, the darker side of it is when we ascribe the demonic to people we don't like. So, if for historical context, think of the church and the Jews, or think of the Catholics versus the Protestants during the Inquisition, or think of Protestants who didn't know what to do.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Think of witches, because no one can explain why this plague is running, and so it's got to be a witch. And so we're going to just describe that there's some women who we don't like, who I don't understand why they're not married, because they're 20-something and they should be married. So we're just going to assume they're witches, and the reason why we have a plague running through our colony in the United States is they're witches and they're killing everybody, even though it's just a fucking plague. But we're going to ascribe Satan to it, and the fact that they're Satan worshipers, and come up with a way where they can't win or lose when we put them on trial, and we put them on trial.
Yeah, if they weigh as much as a duck.
Yeah,
then,
that is the really dark side to the Satan. There is a Satan out there who is at war with me, and I can't figure out why the world is working the way it is. Most of the time, it's because you're not accepting your own choices and you're scapegoating. And a lot of times it's because I just can't figure out how the world is, but I really have to have some kind of answer to explain it. So therefore I'm going to explain that Satan is at war with us, and there's some human element who's involved, who's part of the cabal, and we're going to persecute them.
Right. Yeah, I think that that's a true element of what goes on, is we do ascribe that to certain people. I don't think it's as much anymore in our culture, because like what I was getting at is, again, I think we do it, but we do it in different ways. So it's not like we're sitting there and saying that person is, you know, a Satan worshiper.
Okay, I totally agree with that.
I was like, that's more what I was getting at, where again, we don't. And again, you talked about this earlier, is that we've stepped away from the spiritual side of things. So we sit there and we don't recognize those types of things. We don't sit there and say, wow, that person is really filled with the Spirit. And we don't sit there and say that person is really filled with the devil.
Right.
Kind of thing. But that being said, is we do have those, how our culture works is we do have it to where we recognize that there are people that become outcasts.
They're outside of the tribe.
Outside of the tribe.
And we got to blame them for whatever's going on.
Yes, and we blame them for whatever is
so
going
if you
on.
like this discussion that we're having and it scratches an itch, I would advise you to read a book called Scapegoat by René Girard. He's a French intellectual from the 19th, 20th century. He died early 2000s. He has a book. He's a Christian. He wrote a book on scapegoat, and he details throughout human history this idea. Literally, Colton didn't even know we were talking about it, but he details this whole archetype of how society is framed around scapegoating minorities.
Yeah.
And 99% of the time it's used for religious purposes. I would agree with you now that we're now post, not even Judeo-Christian, but we're just post-religion in the world. We've now reached this like secular humanist. We still have scapegoats. They're just not built around religious purviews, as René Girard lays out. But I would definitely, it's not a long book, but it is, once you read it, it completely exposes the world. And you're like, oh, now I know how the world works. The world completely operates in this way. And again, he kind of lays it out in the book, but I pull the thread even further. That's how this whole discussion, whether or not you think it's literal or figurative, works in the Old Testament, where Satan is mentioned. It is a scapegoat. It's a scapegoat Israel's being persecuted or Israel's being exiled because this Satan comes around. It's like, no, you're blaming Babylon or Persia coming in and taking you over because you're not living up to what God intends and
Right.
living as a light to the world.
And that's where we get the conversation where I've talked about before, where hell, this idea of hell, which again, everybody believes that Satan is this ruler over, is again, this idea of hell is a place where you have put yourself, where you have decided to live your life outside of the will that God has placed for you. And so Babylon is this hell, so to speak, of God protected you, but you decided to turn away from what God had planned for you. And so therefore God says, okay, then like if you choose not to be a part of me, then you don't get any of my protection and any of anything coming for you. And so therefore the Israelites suffer through that process. And you may sit there and think, well, what about, in Egypt and all that kind of stuff, which are good conversations to have. But again, these are how people explained what was going on in the Old Testament.
Well, let's deal with Egypt real quick. Let's just deal with Egypt real quick. Joseph, look, yes, there was a Broadway play and then a movie done over Joseph and his wonderful Technicolor Dreamcoat. Let's be really honest. If you read the Old Testament, Joseph is the hero of the story, and his brothers are, I would say, still understandably when I'm finished telling this, but they're the villains. Look, if you actually read it, Joseph is a insufferable, arrogant asshole of a brother who runs around telling everyone he's great, everyone sucks balls, and they're meaningless.
But also you shouldn't kill that person.
I understand that. I'm not taking a literal view of the story. My point
I
is,
got you.
the reason why I said let's bring that up is another thing that I don't think we talk about in a modern Christian sense is whether we like it or not. Well, we don't talk about it, but we look around it. We see it all the time. I mean, it goes back to the suicide discussion we're talking about. Generational sin is a problem.
Yeah, but here's something that needs to be said about the Joseph story, and what always continues to be a theme for the Bible is that God can take a really crappy situation and turn it into something that is good for him and for his people. And so, for example, when you look at the Joseph story, is that Joseph has these dreams and he has this really shitty situation come upon him. And he has this whole redemptive process to which he is able to save his family from the famine of the world that they were living in and take them over to Egypt because of his status that he had in the Egyptian empire, and bring them over and have that. And so, like, if we want to go even further down the line, and we've talked about Babylon tonight, where we talk about Babylon, again, the enslavement and the relinquishing of power that God said, okay, well, I'll turn you over to yourselves and I'll let your enemies come after you, because again, that is the harshest punishment that God can bestow, is to be completely uninvolved in what's going on with you. There's still good that came from Babylon, was the fact that they were again able to write down their history. We wouldn't have the Hebrew Bible, is what we've talked about today, if it wasn't for the fact that they went to Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar was adamant about learning their culture and having it written down and recorded, to which it wouldn't have been what it was to this day. And so that's extremely important in their storyline, where God continues to use these terrible situations to invoke healing on his people, which is everyone across the world. So, I don't know.
So I would say, look, that's a great point, and I would say that's always there's two ways to view the world as a Christian. Once sin had, I think Christians have to then look to the hope and the redemptive side of it. But I think the story of Joseph and him being, frankly, a precocious asshole as a kid, that if we take the story literally or figuratively, where his brother's like, fuck this guy, we're going to sell him to slavery. Or you even take the story of Abraham or Abram and Sarai, who then becomes Sarah, where they're told they're going to have a kid, and neither one of them take God seriously, and both of them are like, well, you need to sleep with your handmaiden and have a baby from them. And God says, well, that's great, and I'm going to bless them because he's still the firstborn.
Right.
But I'm also going to tell you, because of how humanity frankly works, we look at that and we feel like, well, God's... It's funny, we look at both non-Christians and Christians look at the Isaac and Ishmael story and be like, well, God's cursing him. Like, no, God's just actually laying out how humanity works.
Right.
Which is firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn bullshit.
Yeah.
And so he's like, I'm just telling you, you've had the baby. I'm going to create a covenant that I had not created with that baby before. But because you did what you did, I'm still going to be a bigger man and create a covenant. But I'm just telling you, the offspring of the firstborn and the secondborn, even though my primary covenant is with the second, and again, whether we're taking this story literally or figuratively, to me doesn't matter, they're going to then forever be in conflict.
Right.
And Ishmael is the heirs of Ishmael are the Arabs, and the heir of Isaac are the Jews. And what do we see today? We see that conflict. And so, I'm sorry, the other story is as Christians, is we should try to live as perfect a life as we can, so we don't create generational sin problems within our own families, ecosystems, whatever. And yes, if we create those, to your point, God is still there, Jesus is still there to meet redemption. But how much pain are we creating amongst our offspring and our offspring before we get to that point? Because that's just how the world works. It's just a broken world. And redemption is always out there. But
Always.
we have to avoid these generational sin moments where we say like, oh, I hear what you're telling me, but I don't really believe you. So, or it's not on my time frame, so I'm just going to do this. It's like, if you just remained a little patient and believed me.
Yeah.
And we create these problems because we have to have it when we want to have it.
I say we call it there.
I think we do. Yeah, so we thank you for listening to this episode of the Go to Hell podcast. Strong opinions, weekly held. Email us at tim@gotohellpodcast.com, colton@gotohellpodcast.com. Hit us up at our Substack at gotohellpodcast.substack.com. Twitter at gotohellpodcast.com, or I think it's Instagram, it's gotohellpod. And Colton, if you don't like this non-alcoholic beer, then you can go to hell.
It's bad.